So this week, we'll be focusing on the perspectives of students, and we'll be hearing from some student panelists that have been pulled together by HEROES, the Healing Everyday Racism in Our Schools, and the New Trier Coalition for Diversity.
Any racism that I experienced at New Trier wasn't just like slurs or like things like that, but it was more like I'd noticed certain friend groups would like only be friends with other white people, and especially if they had similar political backgrounds. I don't know, it's more like ignorance and like misinformation rather than outright racism, you know? So I was just exposed to a lot of people who weren't taught, I don't know, manners when it comes to racism. A lot of, so what are you comments, things like that, or how did you get into this school even though it's a public school? Things like that. I don't think all the kids at New Trier saw it because it really depends on the people you're friends with and the types of classes you take. A lot of people tend to like stick to their own kind, where you kind of become friends with people who are the same racial, financial, political backgrounds as you are. So a lot of racism happened within those friend groups, or you were in like a diverse friend group like me, because I didn't really have the option to go join like a friend group of Black people or Japanese people, because there was also limited numbers there at New Trier. I ended up having a pretty diverse friend group who was very accepting. So yeah, definitely not everyone's seeing the racism. It completely depends on who you surround yourself with.
I do also think that a lot of students would pass their racist comments as jokes, and then you don't want to be the one to then correct them because you don't want to sound overly sensitive, or you don't want people to think that you're taking things too seriously. But I think sometimes people don't realize, like, when I was a sophomore and people were daring me to yell Allahu Akbar in the hallways, how that's going to look. First of all, just as a white woman, most people don't assume I'm Muslim. I do get a lot of the questions about when I converted, why aren't I covered, that sort of stuff, even though I was born into the religion. But yeah, so when people were daring me to do that, I didn't obviously go along with it. It's not something I wanted to do. But some of the students were kind of like, oh, I thought it was a joke. I thought it meant like God is great. I thought, that's something you like to say, something you should say. And then I was kind of seen as someone who couldn't take a joke.
I just don't believe that New Trier has really prepared its students to be modern global citizens, or even necessarily good members of their future university communities, because New Trier isn't necessarily teaching students to reflect on racial equity in their own communities. And then there's a trickle-down effect from there. If this isn't being done, then how are students learning to channel compassion, which is part of that motto, in a way that doesn't feel like guilt or a savior complex? And then where are we fostering any impetus to get involved? So we can start teaching cultural competency in high school. I don't think the first time students think about diversity should be in college.
I frankly haven't had many experiences, if any at all, within my friend group. I think part of that is due to the fact that it's pretty diverse and we're all pretty like-minded. However, I do remember, I think it was freshman or sophomore year, I did cross country at New Trier, and overall I think I got really close to the guys on that team. It's a great sport. And I think like just going to practice every day, and like in any sport, it's easy to bond with other kids. But there was one instance, like we were all in a group chat, and me and one guy were having an argument, and it wasn't over anything like big, or that like drastic or whatever. But he did make like a joke, and it was somewhat of a racist joke, not like Sora said, like it wasn't explicit, like use a slur or anything, but it did kind of rub me the wrong way a little bit. And I just remember when I saw it, I didn't even initially react. It was actually a lot of the other kids who were in that chat who kind of immediately stood up for me, because they immediately recognized it as, okay, this is something that clearly this guy should not have said or done. And I think the fact that I didn't react immediately just kind of shows how maybe like within New Trier, I was already kind of not used to it, but just not super sensitive to something like that, or just I was just kind of prepared for something like that to happen almost. Like it didn't strike me. It almost felt like kind of back to what Dina was saying, like if I kind of made a big deal out of it, then it would kind of backfire on me. So I almost just like habitually push it aside. But I have to say that the bright side of that situation was that the other kids on my cross country's team really did stand up for me. So I think in that situation, it was good. But at the same time, just the environment in Mature kind of has prepared me to brush those things aside, which should definitely change.
Well, first, I think it's really hard to say that any one group faces more or less racism, because I think it can happen to anyone at any time. But I will say that in particular, especially given the examples here, it seems like it tends to be underrepresented minorities that get the most, I guess, like not necessarily blatant in the sense that you would think of it, because like everyone said, it's not necessarily blatant at New Trier, but in terms of like negativity or harm that it causes to the people who are affected most by it. I think that tends to be the case, but I guess more broadly, I would say that like thinking about why this happens, if you just think about the demographic of New Trier and you think about just like human beings, what they're likely to say to people to their faces versus not to their faces. People in general are less likely to say harmful things to someone to their face. And so when you have a group of people that are not diverse, people are way more comfortable saying things that maybe aren't correct or are racist or wrong. And so I think when you just have an environment where there's so few minority students, that presence isn't felt for many of the students who are in the majority. And I think they feel more comfortable saying things that they really shouldn't.
I find that racist attitudes are more targeted towards groups who do not like act quote unquote white. For example, I have another Asian friend at New Trier, and we've actually spoke about it, and they've told me that in order to not be targeted in their friend group, which is mostly comprised of other white people, they have to kind of downplay their culture and try to fit in as much as possible, which includes dressing in like the trending clothing brands, avoiding like certain foods, and just copying the behavior of their white peers. And honestly, throughout my life, I've also kind of had to do something like that in order to fit in and not receive like any like microaggressions aimed towards me. And I just find that part incredibly sad. And then also regarding the factors that exist in society that normalize this racism, I feel as though many like figures of authority in my life have all been white. For example, the only non-white teacher I've ever had has actually been a substitute teacher. And additionally, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of people living in the North Shore are white, and that just means that many people will like dress and act in similar fashions, and this will just, as I mentioned before, maybe cause people to feel like they have to just downplay themselves in order to fit in.
Incoming freshmen or younger members really don't know how to react, and they don't even process it. And as you grow, get older, you do gain more perspective and so on. But there are insensitivity doesn't really know the bound either. So it's not just limited to students. Obviously, it can be seen as a among teachers. And then we started talking about the second part of the questions of what can or has New Trier been doing. And we talked about different things like seminar day as well as the N-word workshop. And but at the end of our session, Van made a comment of, all these panelists sharing this experience, and most of the members are, if you characterize that, the brown people, and having these many challenges and issues. And what if the Black student come to New Trier? How difficult that be? And that was one of those makes us think even harder, and really sombering question.
Okay, so I'd say advice to incoming students of color at New Trier: surround yourself with a lot of different people from different backgrounds. It's going to take a while to find a friend group that's really open to learning and understanding your experiences. You're going to you might hit some rough patches, but you'll find some people that really love you for who you are. And my biggest regret is not sticking up for myself, out of the fear that I'd be labeled as sensitive. But stick up for yourself. People aren't going to see you as weak. They're going to see you as like strong enough to speak up for what's right.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of Sora, if I can. So at the end of the day, as Sora mentioned, like we grew up like along our white counterparts in the same school, same programming, same vocabulary. So the racist rhetoric that might have been perpetuated in schools, none of us were really given the vocabulary or structure to know how to stand up for ourselves or stand up for others necessarily, because we're all coming out of the same system. So there's nothing inherent to teach us how to deflect or combat that. A few ideas going forward about how to even start addressing this. The first thing I wanted to say kind of echoes what Jennifer just said about teachers, teacher training, teachers of color. What about curriculum that might give teachers of color more freedom and flexibility to incorporate current events from their perspective? What about a unit in each subject that incorporates the racial history from that field? History, science, photography, literature, geography all have rich histories of erasure. And I don't think there's one right answer to how we're supposed to move forward necessarily, but I don't think the right approach would just be one isolated class about cultural competency. I just think the discussions need to be normalized throughout the curriculum, however that might be done.
Something I mentioned in the breakout room. So in my AP English class, we did read literature that touched on these issues, and a crucial part that was missing was connecting it to like where we are today. So it's not about having it be one class or one day where you talk about it. It's like really integrating it into the curriculum, and it's not that hard to do, I don't think, because we were already reading books that talked about this stuff. So we were almost there, but there were some missing pieces. And so current events, talking about like bridging what we're reading about in history to what we're experiencing today is really important for helping people think critically about what's going on.
Overall, my experience at New Cheer went pretty well. I didn't have any hiccups or anything that really honestly hurt me. But I do have to say to any incoming freshman or anybody who's just moving to the district or just New Trier Township, that just kind of like Nikita said, that you will find your group. And I think with my group, we actually did kind of had conversations about touchy topics that probably not a lot of other friend groups did. And I think that's where real advancement can be made, when there's no kind of, it's coming like internally. And I think you really, if you do come across something, you really should stick up for yourself, because ultimately you'll be glad that you did it, and it'll only be easier in the future if incidents occur. And obviously, I mean, I guess you can tell administration, but you'll find out who's really there to support you and who's there, kind of who you thought maybe was by your side, but it's not. And I think that's the most important thing to do, is just really stand up and just take ownership of like your culture and everything.